together. Thank you to Elk River Arts Lectures. You know, there's so much kind of, I don't want to call it sewage, but sort of bad air in America these days. We live with sort of blade saw of all our confrontations, and to come here to a community of this size and see this extraordinary turnout to talk about history and poetry and drama and fiction and love and death and politics and all the things that, you know, we have the right of free speech to do, just absolutely tickles me. And I love coming back to Paradise Valley. This is one of my favorite places on earth. On the banks of the longest free-flowing river in the West, some would say the only remaining free-flowing river in the West. Don't ever let them dam it. Keep it free and wild forever. I have some family here. My great-grandfather, their family from County Waterford, of course, moved to Butte, Montana, and that great surge of Irish refugees who skipped Boston and came to Montana, because this was so-called New Ireland, in Thomas Francis Moore's phrase. And, you know, Butte at the time was a city of 100,000 people. There was more Gaelic spoken in the mines of Butte, Gaelic spoken in that town, than any place west of Ireland. They had, I looked this up, 232 bars and 6,000 prostitutes. And one East Coast newspaper summed it up this way: it is simply an outpost of hell. So that's what my great-grandparents settled and built a life. My great-grandfather, the man after whom I'm named, another Timothy Patrick, was tragically killed by one of the wonders of Butte, your streetcars. And his remains, they said in the story I read, was splattered over a 3-block area. So I like to tell people I've left something behind in Butte. My DNA is imprinted all over that town. You want to go looking for it. So, before I get into my story tonight about the Immortal Irishman, I just want to read, if you'll allow me this indulgence, a paragraph I wrote about your home, Paradise Valley, about 35 years ago in a book I wrote called Last Through the Wind. And I was traveling around the West and talking about the struggles and the conflicts in the New West and the Old West. And here's the paragraph I wrote about your home. There are hot springs and religious wackos and some mildly bashful Hollywood heavies hidden throughout Paradise. A number of ranchers, river rafters, fishing and hunting guides, and riders live there as well. It's a good mix, but not that they always get along. But at any time of day, you can look up at the sky and beyond and feel that there's enough room to disagree. I hope that's still the case. I hope that's still the case. So tonight I want to talk to you about one of my favorite Montanans, Thomas Francis Moore, the Immortal Irishman. And it's the subject of my book. He was your territorial governor in 1867, one of his 5 lives that he lived. He affected life on 3 continents. He always wanted to put a dent in history, and he put his dent in history. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this happened, because I was talking to a school today, high school. They said, you know, the writers always get asked these ideas. Where do you get your ideas? I don't ever plan anything. I'm just open to serendipity. I'm open to accidents. So I'm in your capital in Helena, talking to your loquacious, he was then governor, Brian Schweitzer, a man never short of words. And I'm staring at this statue of Thomas More. And I'm reading the words carved into the foot there, and it's like the most fiery language I've ever seen, very well written, against the British Empire. These bastards have taken our freedom, they've taken every breath of life we have. I go, wow, this is amazing. It was from his most famous speech he gave in 1848 in the Irish Rebellion. So governor's sitting there, and I go, who's the dude on the horse? And he says, you call yourself an Irish American and you don't know who Thomas Francis Moore is? I said, no, I never heard of him. And his name should be on the tips of every American's tongue. They should teach his story in history because it crosses so many of the currents of our history. So Marr was flamboyant. He was a brilliant orator. He was born into wealth, born into privilege, and he was a friend when he moved here of Red Cloud of the Sioux and General William Tecumseh Sherman, and Abraham Lincoln hosted him for an hour in the White House when the Irish Brigade won a spectacular battle during the Civil War. As I said, he shaped history on 3 continents: Australia, Europe, and America, and North America. Through his life, you see the whole story of Irish America. And in some ways, you see the whole story of America, although more spectacular. Now, his last episode in his life was here. And his idea, as I mentioned, this is partially why my grandparents came here, was a second chance for the Irish. They'd huddled in these horrible slums. 5 Points was the most famous one in New York City, but Boston. And it gave rise to the second biggest political party of the time, the Know Nothing Party, was solely dedicated to keeping the Irish from ever becoming citizens. And Marr used this phrase, "This could be a last best place for us," before it ever was printed on a t-shirt. Or for that matter, I've just seen it on realty signs recently. Now, just some little bit of context for what he grew up in. He was born in 1823. At the time, for the better part of 7 centuries, it had been a crime to be Irish in Ireland. So it was a crime for an Irish Catholic to own property. It was a crime to own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. It was a crime to play your indigenous music. It was a crime to speak your language, which was Gaelic. It was a crime to play your sport or attend a school that had Englishmen in it. It was a crime to wear your hair in a certain way, to sing a song, to enter a church. Even the graveyard was regulated. They outlawed hurling, and when the Irish moved to Newfoundland, the first example of them immigrating anywhere outside of Ireland, first thing they did after settling in was create a hurling club, which had been outlawed by the Brits. It was a crime to own the harp, because it was considered the music of rebellion. And so, I'm sure everyone here has had a bottle of Guinness in their time. And what do you see on the Guinness label? A harp. Because it was an outlaw instrument. They would pluck people's fingernails if they played the harp. So, this is a quote from the Lord Chancellor of the 18th century, British Lord Chancellor. "The law does not suppose any such person to exist as an Irish Roman Catholic." And he said, "Nor should any such person draw a breath without the Crown's permission." So, the Irish were removed from their land and what became known as the Plantation of Ireland. They brought the Scots in. That's why Irish Catholics and Scots-Irish generally don't get along, because they were brought in to take over land that the Irish had been kicked off of. And they had something called the Pale in the 1400s. It was the 4 counties in the center of the island where they marshaled all the Irish into. And, the Irish were considered savage, drunken, indigenous, crazy. And if you ever went even worse than the Irish, you would go beyond the pale. And that's where we got that term. It was outside of the 4 counties of the pale. So, when Marr was born in 1823, the British Empire was the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. The Union Jack flew over one-fourth of the Earth's land surface. And little tiny Ireland, 30 miles away, was the most troublesome and ungovernable part of that vast empire that covered the globe. In Marr's time, there was a larger garrison of British troops in Dublin than there ever was in India, because the people were so troublesome. Now, as I said, Marr came from privilege. He came from wealth. He was born a merchant's son, a prince of Waterford. He was incredibly good looking, incredibly well educated, spoke 4 languages, really was a charmer. Women were instantly in love with him. So when he gets out of school and he's ready to become a prince of Waterford. And he comes back from his British boarding school and settles into Waterford in his father's home, which you can go into, which I did too. It's a little 7-room hotel in Waterford. I went into his bedroom. This little prince of Waterford arrives in Ireland and wonders what he's going to do. Well, what is happening? This is where history converges with an individual. The Great Famine is just breaking out as he's coming of age. And in less than 5 years' time, 1 million Irish die, and 1 million Irish leave the country. These coffins were just replaceable. They would fall out of the bottoms and take them out, so the next person would come through. You've all heard the term Irish goodbye, which I executed skillfully last night at my fundraising dinner, which is leaving a little early without saying goodbye. The origin of the Irish goodbye is that so many people disappeared during the famine. Where'd they go? They're gone, lost, exiled, off to USA or dead. So the famine radicalized him. It was a fatal toll 10 times higher than the Great Plague of London in 1865. Now, everyone thinks this famine was about the potato rot. And the potato rot did happen, and it was a source of Irish food. A 2-acre plot run by a tenant farmer could pretty much feed a family as long as you had a pig, and maybe you could get some dairy. But they lived off of a 2-acre plot of potatoes, a family could. And the potato rot did kill most of the crop. But here's what most people didn't know, and there's been a lot of scholarship on this. In some ways, the famine was deliberate. And Irish food grown by Irish hands did not go into Irish mouths. They shipped it overseas. The Brits exported oats, dairy, pork, beef, everything that came out of Ireland that could feed a hungry person. While Irish children, their teeth are turning green because they're chewing on grass while going to the soup kitchens. The Brits are exporting food. And they're saying things like, well, we've got to cull the population. They have too many kids. So losing 1 million Irish would not be a bad thing. Now, I have to say, because I don't want to bash the Brits too much, Tony Blair apologized for the famine in 1997, 150 years after the low point. British Prime Minister, he said it amounted to extermination, a deliberate policy by the overlords of Ireland to cull the population through exporting of their food while people were starving. Now, this is what radicalizes Marr. And he joins a group of people, they're called the Young Ireland Movement in 1848, and they want to kick the British out. They want self-government syndrome. They want people to be fed. They go to the docks and they stop exporting food. And they're poets, they're singers, they're essayists, they're novelists, and as you can probably guess, they don't stand a chance against the mightiest empire on earth. So the Royal Navy sends a couple ships up off the Dublin Harbor, nice little town you got here. We could destroy it in an afternoon. The revolution falls apart. Marr is sentenced for treason and thrown into Kilmainham jail, and his sentence is to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, and his remains disposed of as Her Majesty shall see fit. And Her Majesty was young Queen Victoria, who was Marr's age then, 24 years old. So he rots in Kilmainham jail. I went into his jail cell when I was researching the book, and I was telling some people this at dinner tonight. He talked about how the walls of his cell would weep. I didn't understand that until I went inside the jail cell. It's limestone, and Dublin is a muggy, wet climate, and the limestone is porous, so there's like the walls themselves were sweating. So while he's waiting to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, his remains disposed of as Queen Victoria sees fit, she commits his sentence. Great, but he'll never. The new sentence is lifetime banishment to Tasmania. So the Brits have rounded up somewhere in the neighborhood of 163,000 people, mostly petty criminals and orphans, and sent them off to this great experiment. Let's take a continent and make it into a penal colony. And the Irish intellectuals, like Marr, the people who had some education were sent to a special place, Tasmania. So that's where he's supposed to spend the rest of his life. And I have a fairly thrilling chapter in the book where he escapes with the help of pirates and dodging sharks, and somehow, miraculously, after this, he's already led 2 lives. One is in the Irish Revolution, the second is being in exile in the penal colony of Tasmania. He arrives in America, and he gets a hero's welcome. The Irish were hungry. The slums dwelling, dirty, criminally prone masses who washed up in Boston and New York and Philadelphia are hungry for something they can look up to. And that savior, as they call him at point, is Thomas Francis Meagher. So now he begins his other life in America. Now, the Irish had no word for immigrant. The closest word they had was in Gaelic, and it was a word that meant exile. So I want to just give you, this is one of the things I researched and I thought was kind of an interesting little fact. Among the 1.5 million people who left Ireland during the famine, remember 1 million died, 1.5 million left in this short period, was the Lennon family from County Down. And they moved to Liverpool and eventually produced John Lennon and the Beatles. The Kennedys from County Wexford moved to Boston. They produced another John, the first Irish Catholic president. And the Kearneys from County Offaly moved to New York to produce another president, Barack Obama, who on his mother's side is Irish. And I've been to the village where his family is from, and there's big banners hanging, home of Barack-Obama. They're really proud of him. Really proud of him. So now the Irish diaspora is something like 50 million people worldwide. It's 34 million in the United States. Now, as I said, the Irish they weren't model immigrants. They could never have got here on H-1B visa, is that what it's called? They spoke a different language. They were considered somewhat clannish. Their families were too big. They were Catholic, which is a big thing in a Protestant country. And I have to say this, it pains me to say this, they were prone to some petty criminality. And some words even entered our language because of this. The word hooligan came out of the Irish slum. The word shenanigan came out of the Irish slum. Paddy wagon. That's where you put all the paddies after they're drunk all night. So Meagher's like, no, we've got to aspire to something more. We have to go aim higher. We can be better people. And as I said, the Know Nothing Party is then fomented. You think we've had anti-immigration, never had it before? It courses through our history. It comes and goes, comes and goes. It's always going to be somebody who's going to be the subject of this. And the Irish is the first great wave of outsider immigrants who many people said could never be Americans, were subject to this backlash. The Know Nothing Party ran a presidential candidate, as I said. They were the second biggest political party in the late 1850s. They were just openly racist the way they described them Irish. They drew cartoons of them with tails and their whiskers dipped into beer and just these horrible, horrible stereotypes. So how is he going to make the Irish Americans? How is he going to break them into the mainstream? How is he going to break the hold of the stereotype? The answer is the Civil War. And now we enter another phase of Meagher's life. Now, at the start of the Civil War, it was a real question on whether the Irish would fight for the Union. Why? Because they were told, well, you know, if you liberate these 4 million enslaved people, 1 in 3 lived in the South were human property with less rights than a mule. If you liberate these people, they're going to come and take your crappy jobs. Because the Irish had all the crappy jobs. So there was a lot of talk in the Irish community, we're not going to go fight for them because they'll come take our jobs. Meagher took the high road. And he said, no, don't. The way that we become Americans is to show them that we will fight for this country. And so he founds the Irish Brigade, fighting 69th. And they go in all these battles, and they're some incredibly high casualties, but Robert E. Lee was afraid of them. General Sherman praised them as among the best fighters he'd ever seen. They had their own rituals. They played music a lot. They had theater during the downtime. They would have huge festivals. They had a 50% casualty rate during the Civil War. They fought in Antietam, which was the bloodiest single day in American history. 23,000 casualties on that one night. And the hardest thing for them was to fight in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And on the eve of this battle, there's a hill. It's called Mary's Heights. And up on the hill is about 30,000 Confederate soldiers led by Robert E. Lee. And the people who have to charge that hill are the Fighting 69, the Irish Brigade, led by Thomas Francis Meagher. And he knows they're going to get slaughtered, because you walk this, the great Civil War battlefields, you walk this bare hill. And on the eve of the battle, he says, come on, lads, go take a little sprig of green and put it under your cap. Put it under your cap. When they turn these bodies over tomorrow, they'll know an Irishman died for America. So they put these little green sprigs under their caps, and they were slaughtered. Meagher himself was shot from a horse twice. Emotionally, he never recovered. Physically, he recovered. But he had recruited, he knew, when he turned over those bodies that morning with the sprigs under their caps, he recognized the faces of many of those boys. He had recruited those people to fight for America. So it destroys him. And now he gets out, he'd been a brigadier general, he gets out of the army, the Civil War is still on, but the end is in sight. And now he starts his final lap in life, although he's only in his 40s at this time. And he's named the secretary through an administration that wanted to reward him for his service of the Territory of Montana. The secretary is the second ranking person, the territorial governor being the first. He's never heard of Montana. He has no idea where it is, what it is, or anything like that. And his poor long-suffering wife, whom he wrote this beautiful letter to, I reproduced it in the book. He said, look, I'm a fugitive. I'm an exile. I'll never see my family. I'll never see Ireland again. But if you, my love, will take me as your husband, I will share everything with her. And so she goes with him, and they go to Virginia City, which is the territorial capital. And there's no other way to put this, but it was a shithole. She was just shocked when they arrived. It was deadly. There were drunks strolling in the street. You couldn't tell the horses from the people who were waking up from a hangover. The governor's mansion was a 500 square foot log cabin that was off plumb. And when they arrived in Virginia City, the territorial capital of North Montana, the existing governor is there. And he's all dressed up, and his family's got their suitcases, and they're ready to go. They're going to catch a stagecoach, and then they're going to catch a train, and they're getting out of Dodge. And he just hands them the keys. He goes, so glad you're here. You're the new governor. I'm out of here. And he flees. And suddenly, Thomas Francis Meagher, exile of Tasmania, of Ireland, Civil War Hill, is your governor. And they move into the 500 square foot log cabin. Now, the first thing they asked the new territorial governor to do is to round up the Indians, get rid of the remaining indigenous people, the Blackfoot. The Crow, of course, were allies with the Americans, but they're still the Sioux. There were different bands who were not letting them move into what is now Bozeman. So he's assigned to go get a voluntary militia and go and round up the last of the original Montanans. Well, Mark can see a little bit of a parallel between what we were doing to the Indians and what the British had done to his people. They took their language, they took their land, and they took their culture, and they told them they could never live on the traditional places they'd always been. So he sort of fakes it. His heart's not in it. He gets a little, militia together, and they gallop off into a valley, and he writes off, could find no Indians. Going back to Virginia City. So these couple campaigns where, Sherman's trying to get him, this is now after the war, it's 1867. Sherman's the commanding general of the army. he's trying to get Marr around. And Marr's he just sends these, it takes 8 months for a dispatch to get from Montana back to Washington. He says, no, all's peaceful, found no Indians. And I think, although he never explicitly said this is where I'm departing, as they say in the legal circles, calls for speculation counsel. My speculation was that he saw this parallels, that he saw the exact thing the Americans were doing to the Indians as the Brits had done to the Irish. Now, his final moments are with the vigilantes. And you all know the story of the Montana vigilantes. One scholar said it was the deadliest campaign of vigilante killing in American history. And that includes the Ku Klux Klan, which I've written about. In one small period, at the end of 1866, the vigilantes of Montana, they were all mostly upstanding citizens. They weren't, your roaming groups of banditos. They were, some of them were bankers, some of them, had big ranches. They were your upstanding citizens. In that one period in 1866, they hanged 37 people. None of them got a trial. None of them got habeas corpus. None of them got due process on American land. What happened to the Constitution? They were targeted, they were found, they were strung up. That's who Marr's dealing with in his final act, in this amazing life that he's lived so far. So one of the people they arrested, thrown in jail, and said he was going to hang, was pardoned by the territorial governor, Thomas Francis Marr. What the vigilantes did was that night they went into the jail, they broke in, they grabbed the guy, took him out, strung him up by a tree outside of Virginia City, and attached to his body was a note that said, Thomas Francis Marr, you're next. He's the governor. So that sets the stage for probably one of the oldest and least known mysteries of the American West, which is what happened to Thomas Marr. And he rides up to Fort Benton on official business with several people. Along the way, he gets dysentery, which was, by the way, the leading cause of death for most white people in the West during that period. It was never natives, it was dysentery, drinking bad water. Quite common. Bad food, bad water, it would kill him. So he gets about dysentery, he rolls into Fort Benton, and he sees an old friend, and they talk a little bit, and the old friend is kind of surprised because Marr, who is a true Irishman, does not have a drink that night. He said, I'm not feeling well. And he goes to one of the river boats that's parked on the shore, and you can still see them right off the shore of Fort Benton today. And that night, someone yells out, "Man overboard!" And they look, and Marr's body has gone overboard into the swift currents of the Missouri River. Now, a very close ally of the vigilantes and a man who wanted to be the next governor quickly tells all the newspapers that, well, he was drunk. You know the Irish. He had to be drunk. That's the only way that they die. And so he spreads the story that, good man that he was, Thomas Francis Marr was a victim of his own inebriation and fell off the boat into the Missouri River. But other evidence shows that he was murdered. And it was the vigilantes who murdered him, just as they threatened to do. And that they pushed him over the side. His body was never found. Now, about 10 years ago, somebody put together a grand jury. I think it was in Bozeman, it could have been in Missoula, and impaneled 12 average citizens, and a real prosecutor, county prosecutor, and a real defendant argued the case of whether Marr was murdered. And the jury came to the conclusion that in fact he was executed, that he was a victim of the vigilantes. And I'm waiting for your Montana school books to correct the record. I hope that isn't long. Now, the statue went up, of course, and my great-grandfather was one of the people who was behind it. The statue, in Helena, you could see it from miles away, went up at a period when the Irish were under pressure, and they wanted to reach into something that gave them pride. So that's, one more thing on this. So Marr's legacy, It is an extraordinary legacy for somebody who died at the age of 43. I mean, I was writing this book, I thought, God, how can anyone even approach this? His legacy is that there are free people in Australia. Remember, it was a penal colony, in part because of him. Why? Because when he was in exile there, under a pen name, he wrote these fiery polemics, which were printed in all the underground newspapers all over Australia, that eventually led to a degree of freedom for people in Australia. His pen had an effect on that continent. There would be free people in Ireland, eventually, finally, after 800 years, in the 1916 Easter Rebellion, in part because of Thomas More. Why? Because they found his speeches, and they memorized them, and they were passing them from person to person, and they were citing some of his, he was known as Mar the Sword. They were citing some of those words that are on the pedestal of that statue that led to the only successful revolution against the Brits. There were many, many failed ones. That one succeeded ultimately. And to our purpose here as Americans, no matter where you're from, there are free blacks. There were free blacks, formerly enslaved people who were given the rights of citizenship, who were freed of their shackles and their bondage, in part because of Thomas Francis Meagher. Now, when they were slaughtered at Fredericksburg with the sprigs under their cap, Meagher, a lot of them just said, what did we die for? What did we die for? And Meagher would say, point to the Emancipation Proclamation, which Abraham Lincoln issued in 1863. Those immigrant Irish died for free blacks. And it's a great sacrifice that Meagher wanted to be sure that everybody knew. Now, one more thing. In 1963, just a few weeks before he was assassinated, a young man, President John F. Kennedy, the same age about as Thomas Francis Meagher, went to Ireland. And it was back when we had presidents who loved history, literature, poetry, who could, when he got off the airplane and walked down the steps, they said it was like a rainbow unfolded on the tarmac. And he goes to speak to the Irish Parliament. He's very witty, he sees his family. And what does he do? He brings one of those caps from the Fredericksburg battle. And he tells, it just gives me chills, and he tells the story of those Irishmen dying with those little green sprigs under their caps and turning over those boys and seeing the faces. And he tells the story to illustrate how they became American. They left their country, but they were American now because of that great sacrifice. So in closing, what I learned from Meagher's tale, I always knew that we carry memory, the burden of memory. My parents taught me that. There's that burden. You have to carry it, and you have to promote it, and you have to tell your children about it, the good and the bad. We're having an argument right now. Can we only tell the smiley version side of our history? No, you tell the good and the bad because it makes you a better person. We carry that memory, that collective memory. And for the Irish, as you know, it's been put to song on any given night, in any given bar in Montana. You can walk in and hear a song whose origin was in one of the many failed revolutions in Ireland. A great song usually, too. It's been put to poetry. In my family, it was spread from elderly family members to younger family members. And yes, in the interest of fairness, it's been embellished at times. But we Irish are great believers in the adage that the best stories belong to those who can tell them. Thank you. So we have some questions, and I'm an open book. I'll answer hopefully anything. And I just hope the one thing, if you could take home from tonight, is just some appreciation for this history. That when you look at that statue, just think of the life that lived that thing and the sacrifices. And when I was doing this, Meagher was a footnote. He was a footnote. And one of my great pleasures in life has been to take the footnotes and give them their proper due. So the last book I wrote was about the Klan taking over, the Ku Klux Klan taking over the state of Indiana exactly 100 years ago today. The governor wore the sheets. All 9 representatives of Congress were sworn members of the invisible empire of the Ku Klux Klan. The mayor of Indianapolis, they burned Catholic churches. They strung up black men in the dead of night. They went after Jewish merchants, smashing their windows. They had expanded the range of immigrants from blacks to they hated Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. And one woman brought them down. So the subtitle of that book is How the Ku Klux Klan Nearly Took Over America and the Woman Who Brought It Down. And that's an example of a footnote of somebody that gets sort of written out of the story, and then you find, my God, they really had a better place. So, we have a microphone around us? Okay.
Tim, thank you again for a wonderful evening of storytelling. Thank you. So I have a bookend question for you about the beginning and the end of your writing process. So when you first arrive at a person, a place, a time, what is the inner bell that goes off that tells you this is a story I have to write about? And then at the end of your stories, at the end of your major books, are you willing to let go, to say goodbye, or is there a siren song that continually brings you back?
Are you a secret writer? That's very well put. And before I answer the question, I want to thank Ken who hosted us last night. I have felt so welcome these 2 days I've been in Livingston. It's just been extraordinary. And the cherry on the cake is tomorrow morning I get to go fishing. Really, I mean, I can't express my gratitude enough. You've really made me feel welcome. It just touches me so much. I do a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking, but God, you guys totally made me feel at home. Now the question. Yeah, you like to think there's a bell going off, but there isn't an actual bell. But there's a point where, you try out a lot of stuff, you start to research, and you say, is it there, is it there? I always look for 2 things. I look for telling a story that's largely unknown, so I can add something to the great tapestry of American history. And, most Western stories are unknown. They just don't get told. When I go back and visit friends in New England, every square block has a little, history marker. So-and-so took a crap here. And, the first ever, bread made without yeast was Dunkin' Donuts. Okay, I get it. You got Dunkin' Donuts, and then you come out here and you got 100 and some miles and you say, oh, a wagon train crossed this river. So I think our story has been untold. So that's the first thing I do. There's lots of terrific stories embedded in this land. And almost all those stories are tied to the land. That's what I like about Western history, is that the land is the central character. That's certainly in my Dust Bowl book. The land is the central character. In the Big Burn, the fire, destroyed 3 million acres, the land is the central character. And then I look for drama, highs and lows. Thomas More waiting to be executed. In the Big Burn, Pulaski takes these people who are going to die and orders them to go into this mine shaft while this 3 million acre wildfire burns all around them. Half of them have their feet burned off. 2 of them drowned in the mine shaft because they put it was only like 6 feet high at points and then faces down in the puddles. The guy who invented the Pulaski, by the way, after whom it's named, never got a dime off it because he didn't do the trademark on it, on copyright. So I look for unknown stories. I look for, and that's what the bell goes off. I said, God, and then can I tell a larger story around the unknown story? Can I tell something else about, is there a collective narrative there? So I like to think, even though Mars is an Irish story, it's pretty much an American story. The Irish don't own that story any more than, I I'm trying to think of an analogy, but I call them, why is the Dust Bowl story our story? Because it reflects on man's hubris with nature. And when I was interviewing those 95-year-olds who lived through what I call the worst hard time, when a bright day like today would turn midnight black, as one old timer told me, it was like 7 midnights in a jug. When that happened, they all knew that they screwed up. They didn't need an environmentalist to tell them that. When I sat with those room full of 95-year-olds, they'd said, yeah, we screwed up. We plowed up the grass. And I talked to this old guy who was half Apache, half Anglo, and his father had been a cowboy on the XIT ranch in Texas, half Apache, half Anglo. And he said during the Dust Bowl, he looked out, it was rolling. These things were like, they literally were a mile high, some of these storms, and 100 miles wide. Imagine the Gallatin Range on the move, but 100 miles long. And the kid said, Dad, what is it? What is it? And he gave the best single description I'd ever heard of the Dust Bowl. The cowboy said, wrong side up. Turned all the grass. And when I heard that quote, you talk about bells going off, that's when they go off. I said, there it is. And I saw that story as almost a biblical story. So yeah, there's moments like that, and that comes from doing so much research. And you keep researching, and you just hope that something like that happens. Now, to excellent end of the question, I hope I'm not boring you guys with the process. Yeah, it's pretty hard to let it go. You've been dating this girl for 3 years, and either she's just not that into you, or you're going to stick around. And you live this thing, you breathe this thing. I have dreams about all my books. All the characters come to life. I see them. I was talking to Thomas. I probably had 20 conversations with Thomas More in my dreams. Now he's Victorian prose. I wish he would get to the point. It's a dream. I don't have that much time. But yeah, it's hard to let go. I'm just finishing a book now about Buffalo soldiers in the 1880s, the end of the Indian Wars. And it's following one character. And my editor loves it. And she said, okay, just make your editing remarks and give it to me. I go, no, I can't let it go. The writers in this room, I don't want to let it go yet. Because once it's gone, and then it's that. I've been very lucky because I tell these fairly obscure histories, and I've found a great audience. Americans have embraced these stories. The last book on the Klan, I just thought no one was going to read it, and it sold a million copies. So those of you who say, Americans are afraid of our history, we should only tell the good side. I mean, people are starved to hear all sides. We're human beings. We understand nuance. We know we're not all good or bad. And I agree with Ken Burns, who I worked with on a documentary about the Dust Bowl. Spent 2 weeks with him in this little quaint village in New Hampshire. I said it was suffocatingly quaint. He got mad at that. But he said, ultimately, by telling the bad and the good, you're a stronger American. The good, because even in the Klan book, there's some great characters who overcome this monster. So I went on too long. Another question?
Thank you.
I was wondering if you had any meaningful takeaways from Edward Curtis.
How long was Edward Curtis?
No, any meaningful takeaways that have just stuck with you.
I'm not sure the exact answer is.
Meaningful takeaways from
Meaningful takeaways. Sorry, I didn't hear that part. Yeah. Edward Curtis was the photographer of the North American Indians. He did the greatest, for those of you who don't know anything about him, the greatest photographic achievement in history by far. 20,000 pictures of Native Americans anywhere in the United States where people were still living somewhat by their old ways. And it cost him his life. It took almost 40 years. In the end, he lost his copyright to one of the most valuable books on earth, because right now a volume of the Curtis 20 volumes sells for more than $2 million. And he was an extraordinary man. Spent a lot of time in Montana. That was another case of me sort of stumbling over. So I'd be walking to a Seahawk game in Seattle, Pioneer Square, and there's this Curtis gallery. And I'd walk by it and I look at these pictures, and you've all seen these Curtis pictures. And I go, those are really nice. And then I just started asking around about his life, and I go, oh my God, this guy was born in a homestead cabin, was dirt poor, taught himself photography, became the premier portrait photographer. He was like the Dale Chihuly of Seattle. If you went to Seattle, you wanted to see his pictures. And then he gives up that lustrous life he feels like this urge that Native Americans, all their old ways are going away. I've got to capture it before it goes. That's why I called it Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. He never got a night's sleep. He was racing. He went everywhere the tribes lived, to the bottom of the Grand Canyon to see the Havasupai, to the far edge of the Olympic rainforest, to the far north, to whatever Comanche were left of the Lords of the Plains in Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And I retraced all the steps. It was a wonderful book to research and write and go to Indian country and see how much he was still appreciated. Now, I always make this point. You asked how meaningful. Academics, and I hope I'm not offending any of the academics in the audience here, have criticized Curtis. They say, well, he would pose these Indians, and what did he really know about tribal life? Well, I'll make 2 quick points on that. One is, every single place in Indian country that I went to had Curtis pictures prominently displayed. In some cases, they were mural-sized. And you ask them, why do you have that picture? And they'd say, look at those eyes. You can't fake those eyes. That's my great-grandfather. Those are my people. The other thing was, and people forget this when they criticize him, he was a portrait photographer. His job was to find personality, not to be a documentarian. He was only a documentarian by accident. So, I'll give you one quick example. There's a famous picture he took of a young man, I believe he was Blackfoot, and when he showed up, Curtis would go to a reservation and spend all summer. And sometimes he would never take a picture. He just wanted to get to know him, get acquainted. He always had native guides with him who toured his bridge. So this guy shows up to have his picture taken. Curtis would usually have, his studio was a teepee or a tent, and he would adjust the light on the flat. And this guy shows up and he's wearing a cavalryman's, United States cavalryman's uniform with bars. The guy was an officer. Long braided hair, cavalryman's uniform. And Curtis says, why are you wearing this? And he goes, because my dad killed this guy. And this is one of our best possessions. We're really proud to have this cavalryman's uniform. So I've read some of these academic treatises that say, well, Curtis would dress an Indian up in a cavalryman's uniform. No, he never did that. They showed up and said, take my picture in this man's uniform. He would always have them dictate the terms. And so I know in Indian country, Curtis is appreciated for the history that he made and what he was able to capture. In his late years, he became a passionate advocate for Indian citizenship. As you know, they were never awarded citizenship until the 1930s. And he started out, he was a really good-looking guy. He looks kind of like Brad Pitt. I tried to get Brad Pitt to play him in the movie. And, he started out as kind of a dandy, but he ended up deeply passionate. Again, having lost everything. He had spent his last years in a crappy apartment in LA taking studio pictures for Hollywood of Italians dressed up as Indians. It was horrible. And having lost the whole thing of it. But that said, it's a magnificent achievement. And he only did 400 complete copies of the 20 volumes. So the Vatican has one. The British monarchy has one. Gonzaga University had one, but they sold it, and I've given them no end of shit for that. They have them in a handful of places here and there. They rarely come up for auction. But if you ever get a chance to just leaf through and look at he did all this with an 8x10 glass negative. So imagine going to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, or on the wild, undammed Columbia River, which he was on when he was doing the Tribes of the Columbia. No dams were on it. There's 12 dams on it now, 12 major dams. he has this glass plate negative, and then he has to schlep this thing out of the Grand Canyon and take it back to Seattle, where he exposes the picture from the glass plate negative. And from that, he does 20,000 portraits. The only person who came even close to him was the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. So you got me going on Curtis. Thanks.
I actually had just a brief follow-up because I was going to ask about Curtis. I was wondering, one of the things that struck me about him was that he was an ethnographer as well as a photographer, and you in your book write about the fact that he documented native customs and native languages, and I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you access some of that information.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because to this day, a lot of people in Indian country credit his work because he did record, what did they eat? What was their sex life like? What does their religion mean? When he was at the Smithsonian in 1905 trying to get money from the Smithsonian to fund this venture that bankrupted him, they said, well, Mr. Curtis, this is a direct quote, we have many Indian experts here at the Smithsonian, and some of them have even seen Indians. And he's living with them. He's spending all this time. And then he said, well, I just need some money because I'm going to spend 2 years with the Apache. I'm writing about the Apache now, all these different bands of them, and everyone thinks of them as just Geronimo. There's so many different bands. But they said to him, and he goes, and I'm particularly interested in their spiritual life. They worship one God, Ussen, U-S-S-E-N. And the Smithsonian expert said to him, Mr. Curtis, I'm sorry, the Apache have no religion. And so in the very first paragraph of the North American Indian, where he's talking about the Apache, Curtis writes, every single hour of every day in the life of an Apache person is infused with spirituality. And it was almost like putting the knife in the Smithsonian. So yeah, I think, if I'm answering your question, that he did a lot of, but kind of accidental, and he always had tribal guides with him who were his deep friends. Now, one of his closest friends was a Crow, not far from here, who had been taken away to the Indian Industrial School. Have you ever heard of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School? They would ship these Indians kids, take them away from their families, and move them off to Pennsylvania to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And the job, and this is their motto, was to wash the Indian out of them. It's to make sure they came back to the reservation with no sense of their culture. I mean, if you do that to the Irish, we'd kill some of them. And so he had gone to the Carlisle Indian School, then he comes back to the Crow Reservation, and he becomes Curtis's best friend. And Curtis knew this guy, spent more time with this guy than his wife. And they were the first two people to uncover what happened to George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn, because they walked the Little Bighorn battlefield with tribal people who'd been allies with Custer, and people who'd been on the other side of the fight as well, the Sioux and other tribes. And so he recreates it. There's a topography map he got. He recreates it. They do a bunch of topo stuff, and then he said he broke the story basically in the North American Indian that Custer was an arrogant, terrible general who led his men into the slaughter, which wasn't the conventional wisdom then. The conventional wisdom was he just bravely had done this brilliant generalship and got surprised. So the point of the story is that he couldn't have done this without the tribal guide he had. And they camped on the Little Bighorn River, spent a winter there. I have a picture of them, just 4 feet of snow and they're freezing. And they spent all night arguing over the story, going back and forth, doing drafts. And so he's getting this input from these people. He's not going back and talking to scholars. He's consulting with the men whose family was a part of this thing. Sad part of that story, and I forget the guy's name, but I can get it in a minute. It's been 15 years since I wrote that book, but the sad part of that story is this person that Curtis had spent so much time with got picked up in a bar fight in Billings and thrown into jail, and some guys kicked the crap out of him that night, and he bled to death. And it just destroyed Curtis. I have some quotes in the book from his letters where he said, I've lost half of myself.
Is that Upshot?
That was it. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Say
Yeah.
again?
That's who it was. And he was, Carl. So, yeah, they were really, the bottom line of what he was doing, they were trying to get the story right. Americans were starting to get this Hollywood version of cowboys and Indians. And it was so much more nuanced than that. And they were trying to do that. Yes, sir.
That was a terrific talk.
Wait.
That was a terrific talk.
She did that in heels, by the way.
I know, and I'm a surgeon, I had this really big worry that she might go down. Well done.
Never going down.
Okay. Glad to hear. That's what's known as hubris. Wait till you. The thing is, what strikes me is a terrific talk. The things that you discuss are not ancient history. They are current events. They are literally 3 generations ago at most. And in my case, I'm 81, it's less than that. And even JFK that you mentioned, it was less than 70 years ago that when he was running for president, he had to go to Houston to assure the Protestant clergy that he would not follow the orders of the Pope. That's how current all this stuff is. This is nothing. The question is, thank you, my son. Anyway, the question is, yes, I guess he's right. Again, oh God.
I can imagine you guys at a football game.
Yeah, right, exactly. We have our own personal football game. And, but how do you carry this to the people to let them know that this is not ancient history, this is not Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, this is today. Every one of these issues that you're talking about is today. Everything in this book is today.
Right.
So how do you do that? How do you get them engaged?
Well, I wouldn't say stumbled, but you stated what I seldom state, but is so obvious in all my books. I don't write history unless there's a huge resonance to today. And people always say, oh, I see echoes of the Trump administration. They go, I've never mentioned Trump. I just lay out the story and let people draw their own conclusions. When I talk about the Irish-American experience, I don't talk about Mexicans. I don't talk about ICE. I just tell their story. And the resonance is there. But the secret, not the secret, but I'll let you in on one of my professional tactics is I do not take on one of these histories just because it's a great story. I always find a great story. But I tell them because they mean something to today. Because I don't believe that history is a dead thing. It's a living thing. And the only boring history is boringly told history. And half the people in this room probably had a crappy history teacher who said that in 1862, and we put up a statue of a banker. And then Montana became a state. And that's when I wrote my first book about the Pacific Northwest, and I was like, God, we've got this history. It's like a couple of railroad dudes came and we cut down some trees and that was it. And I was like, there's so much more. So, but yes, you're spot on. And we should give you another 5 minutes, actually. I'm kidding. You're spot on. I tell these stories, and people always do interviews and do all this stuff, and they always say, well, isn't there a lot of like this or this or this? And I say, well, everyone knows that the famous thing is that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. Of course it rhymes. And our history, it's like in doing the Irish book, I saw this anti-Irish stuff, and then doing the Klan book, I saw this anti-Catholic stuff and this anti-black stuff, and it's like a vein of coal or copper going through the land, and sometimes it's at the surface and sometimes it's deep underground, but it's there. The vein is always there, and we strive to keep it deep underground. Not a perfect metaphor, but that's all right.
When are you going to let go of your latest project?
Where am I going to run?
No.
Just fade into the mic.
When are you going to let go of the book you're writing right
So
now?
I've spent 3 years on this new book about the cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. in 18, takes place from 1877, pretty much the end of the Comanche Wars to 1886 when Geronimo's captured and officially ends the 400 years of wars of nations dating to Columbus's arrival. And I have a great character, wonderful central character, brilliant guy who spoke 3 languages, wrote 2 books, was born a slave, and became the first black graduate of West Point. And his great passion in life, all he wanted in life was to be an officer and a gentleman. And he went west, became the first and only, for almost 50 years, black officer of the cavalry. Got to know Quanah Parker, Geronimo, all the great characters. So we send blacks to do the end of the work of rounding up the reds. And that's the story I tell. But he's impartial, he's a soldier. He's an officer and a gentleman. He's brilliant. He wrote 2 books. One was called The Colored Cadet, and the other was called The Negro Frontiersman. He was damn proud of his role in, claiming the West. So it's this story of the largely unknown Buffalo Soldiers, the end of the Indian Wars, and it takes place in some of the most awful country in America, the Texas Panhandle. And, I go to these places, I research, I spend a lot of time. I said this to someone last night, they have the most precious commodity on the huge flat Texas Panhandle is shade. You go hundreds of miles, you don't see a tree. And so my guy was writing in his diary, he said, we just feel lost in this infinity it was the Llano Estacado, the staked plains. It went on and on and on. And when Anglos came there, they just freaked out. They felt like they were lost in an ocean. Comanche loved it. So there was tons of bison there. And so that was their homeland. Well, part of their homeland. They raided and traded everywhere. So the land is a real character. It's the same Dust Bowl land that I covered in the Worst Hard Time, but in this case, it's for the end of the Indian Wars. And this book, I'm just handing it in now, though I'm reluctant to let my editor get it out of my hands, and it will be out in here. So, again, I want to thank you guys so much.